Hardwick New Hall is one of the gems of the National Trust portfolio of properties, and is arguably, like I said before, the greatest surviving Elizabethan prodigy house in terms of the survival of the building, generally the interiors and the collection. As Nigel mentioned before, the key figure here is Bess of Hardwick, Countess of Shrewsbury, one of the great patrons of the late Tudor age. And most of Bessie's pictures that she collected are in a 1601 inventory, which was compiled as part of her will. As a site of aristocratic female patronage, of picture collecting by someone uniquely so closely connected to the English court and by various associations to the Scottish court, it really doesn't get better than Hardwick. The image on the screen shows Joseph Nash's 1840 lithograph published in his The Mansions of England in the Olden Time, in which we can see the heavy hang of pictures in the Great Hall where we've just been, all of which are portraits, and those that we can make out we can see are mostly 16th and 17th century portraits. The room was famously described by Walpole in 1760. Never was I less charmed in my life. The house is not Gothic, but of that betweenity that intervened when Gothic declined and Palladian was creeping in. Rather, this is totally naked of either. The gallery is 60 yards long, covered with bad tapestry and wretched pictures. And so, as we now know, the tapestries are certainly very far from bad, and likewise the pictures are certainly not wretched, although to be fair, or to be open-minded at least to Walpole, there were a number of pictures in the house at the time of his visit that were in such a bad state of decay that the sitters couldn't be identified, and these pictures were presumably destroyed. And tantalisingly, there was amongst those pictures a portrait of Lady Jane Grey that Bess, who knew Jane, and Jane was one of the godmothers to one of Bess's children, Temperance, Bess kept that portrait in her bedchamber, so it was very important to her. Hardwick to this day is best known for its builder, Bess, for the building, and in terms of the collection, like I said, for the tapestries and embroideries, but it's less well known for the picture collection. So this is something we'd like to address. And for today's purposes, it's an ideal venue. And I'd like to speak about some of these early pictures. Most of the portraits at Hardwick were collected by Bess and her second son, William Cavendish, 1st Earl of Devonshire. He's the good son, as opposed to Henry, who we heard before was the bad son. William inherited the house at his mother's death in 1608. Bess's portrait collection was typical for the time, comprising portraits of family members, royalty, churchmen, and foreign leaders, most of which were displayed in the long gallery in the second floor, where we've been. It wasn't huge, though, in comparison with the largest grouping of portraits in the Elizabethan period, collected by John Lumley, 1st Baron Lumley, that included portraits of nearly 200 sitters, or the large collection of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, that included 45 pictures at Kenilworth and around 150 pictures at Wanstead and Leicester House. The key artist from the period of that Bess and her second son were collecting is Rowland Lockey, who Charlotte is going to be speaking about later. And here we see the well-known portrait of Bess during her last widowhood. James VI at the top right, an 8-year-old boy, and Bessie's 4th husband, George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, all currently attributed to Lockey. And there are 3 versions of the picture of Bess. Hardwick on the left, the National Portrait Gallery version in the middle, and a 3rd private collection that some of you will recognise because of the inscription. And we also have evidence for Bess. There are 3 portraits of Bess in the house, and you've probably seen them all now, and we can point them out later. There is evidence that Bess was commissioning other portraits as well. In her will, she left her daughter Frances my great book of gold set with stones, with her father's picture and my picture drawn in it, so presumably 2 miniatures, which were set within this jewelled book. One of the most important pictures at Hardwick is the full length of Mary I of Scotland, otherwise known as Mary Queen of Scots, who was in the custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury for over 15 years, from 1569 to 1584. And it's clear that during the time she sat for her portrait and she displayed portraits that she owned. The Queen's iconography includes surprising gaps, the most notable of which is the complete lack of portraiture from her 7-year personal reign in Scotland. But with time on her hands during her captivity, portraiture was something that was occasionally attended to. In due course, portraits of the Queen were added to Bess's collection, and they were later displayed at Hardwicke, a house with strong associations with Mary, but that, as Nigel explained, was built after her execution. Documentary evidence reveals that despite her physical constraints, Mary sat for at least 2 portraits during the period when Shrewsbury was her captor, and that she inquired about the possibility of having miniatures of her produced and distributed as potent symbols of loyalty for the Queen's allies, saying, "Among my friends in this country, there are some who ask for my portrait. I pray you have 4 of these made for me, all of which must be set in gold, and send them to me secretly. It would certainly be more convenient to have these high-quality objects produced on the continent as potent symbols of loyalty for the Queen's allies. The risk being seen as undertaking some sort of covert artistic programme which had potentially negative or even dangerous results. However, Shrewsbury, for whatever reason, appears to have sanctioned the Queen sitting for a portrait at least twice. On the 31st of August 1577, Mary's secretary, Claude No de la Boisselière, wrote to Beeson saying, "I was thinking to accompany this letter with a portrait of Her Majesty, but the painter has not managed to finish it in time for me to send it with this," indicating that she probably sat for a miniature that was to be sent with the letter, but unfortunately there's nothing revealed about the artist. Mary certainly kept portraits of herself up until the end of her life. She gave away a miniature the morning of her execution to one of her ladies-in-waiting. The Hardwicke picture is one of a small number of portraits of Mary, of a particular composition known as the Sheffield type, the Sheffield portrait. And here we see the picture at Hardwicke, the reduced and altered picture in the National Portrait Gallery, the Scottish National Portrait Gallery version, and the version at Hatfield. There's also a 5th version in the Palacio de Liria in Madrid. Latterly, the portrait type was thought to be posthumous, and a Jacobean image painted decades after the Queen's execution, produced as part of a programmatic effort by James VI, and first to rehabilitate his mother's tarnished reputation. The portrait's full of biographical references, including the Queen's Catholic religion. The crucifix hangs from a black ribbon around her neck, and the second cross is suspended from her waist, from which in turn hang her rosary beads that she holds with her left hand. The centre of the second cross contains a circular enamelled jewel showing 3 figures representing Susanna and the elders, the biblical story in which a virtuous woman who was to be put to death for a crime she didn't commit was proven innocent and acquitted. Around the jewel is a circumscription, Angustiae Undique, that translates as trouble on all sides. Christ is also referenced in the 4 arms of the cross that hold the enamel. Each contain the Gothic letter S for Salvator. In the top left corner of all the versions is a painted Latin inscription that translates as Mary, by the grace of God, most pious Queen of Scotland, Queen Dowager of France, in the 36th year of her age and reign, and the 10th of her English captivity, SH 1578. And the SH initials refer to the term Anno Salutis Humanae, in the year of the salvation of men. The National Portrait Gallery version comes from Charles I's collection. It was displayed in the tennis court chamber at Whitehall in 1637, where it was described as the picture of Mary of Scotland, King James's mother, at length, before being cut down to its present size. And recent dendrochronology dates it to being contemporary or near contemporary to Mary's life, which is very important in how we see these pictures. The Scottish National Portrait Gallery on the far right, that version is slightly different with the face pattern than the other types. It is painted on canvas, and this came from Cobham Hall in Kent, which was in the collection of the Duke of Lennox. The Hatfield House version was presumed to be the portrait mentioned in the Lumley collection inventory of 1590, as Mary Queen of Scots executed in England. That was bequeathed to Sir Robert Cecil and sent to him by Lumley's widow. However, the portrait of the Queen is listed as one of the pictures of a smaller scantling, that is, of a smaller size, in the 1590 inventory. And there's a Hatfield picture as a full length. It suggests there were maybe two pictures. And the full length came into the collection at another time. The little-known fifth version I mentioned in Madrid has an interesting provenance, supposedly, but it might be apocryphal, that it was left by the 14th Duke of Alba to the 14th Duke of Alba by Cardinal York as a fellow descendant of James II. The depiction of the Queen's face in the Sheffield type is very close in design to a miniature of her by Nicholas Hilliard, which it was presumed to be after. The two autograph versions of Hilliard's depiction are seen here. The Victorian Albert version on the left, and on the right the Royal Collection version. The Royal Collection picture on the right-hand side is thought to be the prime version, as it includes ultramarine in the blue background rather than the azurite in the V&A version. The commission, it would seem, for at least one of the miniatures may have come from Elizabeth I. And at the bottom we have a detail of the Hardwicke picture, the MPG picture, Hatfield picture, and the SMPG picture. The dating of the so-called Sheffield portrait has been inconsistent. As I said, until recently the composition was thought to be Jacobean, and Roy Strong, who missed the reference to a portrait of Mary being at Hardwicke in the 1601 inventory, dated it to around 1610. Supporting the earlier date for the Sheffield type, from a non-scientific viewpoint, is the existence of a French print that reproduces the image at half length and in reverse. On the left here, engraved by Leonard Gautier and published by Pierre Guardel. The image is posthumous. The title of the engraving is La Fière Ronde des Gosses. And below the portrait is a verse that mentions the Queen dying for her faith. That and the fact that compositionally it appears to be part of a group of royal and aristocratic portraits engraved by Gautier in France, according to the dated examples in 1587 and 1588, suggests the print was made very soon after the Queen's death, and as a French response to her execution from a kingdom where she was still Queen Dowager. And you'll see versions on the right which are, these are sort of copies of copies of copies, and they become more and more stylized with time, but they're based on a prototype, which is the Sheffield picture. Another important early picture you may have noticed in the Long Gallery is the unusual double portrait of Mary's parents, James V and Mary of Guise, shown at the top. Probably a more of an emblematic, hybridized image based on two separate portraits. And it relates to another picture in the Duke of Athol's collection at the bottom of James V and Mary of Guise, which in turn relates to a double portrait of Mary and her son James VI. Now, presumably with the way the crown, the numbering has been painted, this has come from the same studio. And the bottom picture, again, you can see is based on the Sheffield type. And the bottom picture was painted around 1583, when negotiations were underway that considered Mary's release from captivity and her return to Scotland to act as a constitutional co-ruler with her son, something that was understandably refused by the Scottish and English courts. The second portrait of Mary at Hardwicke is the very rare double portrait of her with her second husband, Lord Darnley. It was listed in the 1601 inventory following the full length of Mary next door as the same Queen and the King of Scots, with their arms both in one, in the withdrawing chamber. Something of their rather unconvincing appearance is probably due to the fact that the portrait has been damaged and repainted, and the fact that it was in such bad condition it was given away by the otherwise historically minded 6th Duke to Mr. Cribb's picture cleaner, from whom it had to be bought back by the 7th Duke. It was when the portrait returned to Hardwicke that it was renamed, mistakenly or deliberately, as Charles Stuart and Elizabeth Cavendish, the Earl and Countess of Lennox, and the parents of Arbella. And at one time it was also thought to be Shrewsbury and Bess. Evelyn, Duchess of Devonshire, who we heard about earlier, with a somewhat subjective idea of late Elizabethan picture display at Hardwicke, wrote in the 20th century. In an early restoration, an attempt was probably made to make this fit the attribution made subsequently as Mary, Queen of Scots and Darnley. Apart from any other argument against this, Lord and Lady Shrewsbury are not likely to have possessed, or wished to possess, a portrait of Queen Mary with her murdered husband. Whereas a Lennox double portrait was in this house in 1601, I can see no way of dealing with this canvas except by rubbing off all the recent overpainting and putting back just as much paint as is absolutely necessary to make the canvas presentable as a double portrait of the Countess of Lennox and her young son Charles. So I have a fourth or fifth label for the picture. And the double portrait comes loosely from prototypes, including this version of Darnley in the Rijksmuseum, and in reverse, the picture of Mary in the National Portrait Gallery. Here we see two versions of the full length of Bess's granddaughter Arbella. The restored Hardwicke version on the left, on the extreme left. She was, through her father, an heir to both the English and Scottish thrones. And in the past, an amount of confusion has arisen over the extent of the family's promotion of her as Elizabeth I's heir. This portrait, a large and expensive commission, was, however, clearly desired, fashioned and displayed to convey a strong message about the sitter's marriageable status as much as her royal bloodlines. Although, of course, the two aspects of her biography are frequently linked. The huge amount of pearls that Arbella wears on top of her hair, as earrings in a 4-row necklace, her V-shaped girdle, and on the double strings of pearls at her wrist, refer to a hoped-for fecundity in relation to her future marriage. And the marriage is also referred to by the white dress and her loose hair, denoting virginity. The portrait was painted in 1589 when Arbella was in her 13th year, and its production followed a successful visit to court, which was likely the impetus for the portrait, during which time Elizabeth I famously said to the French ambassador's wife, "Look to her well, one day she will be even as I am, however I will have gone before." The inscription in the cartouche at the top left of the composition reveals the sitter's social position to the viewer, naming her as Countess of Lennox, something that was encouraged by Bess. Arbella's inheritance of her dead father's title was contested. She was prevented by the Scots from taking up the earldom because of her gender and because she was English, and more importantly because they would have to pay rents for the extensive Lennox estates. One of the interesting things about looking at the second version on the right, where the face hasn't been altered, is being able to relate it to the picture of Arbella as a child, which some of you will have seen here. And you can see I mean, we mustn't look at portraits as 100% as evidence, but you can see in terms of physiognomy the similarity. And also to the sometimes contested by Peake in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery at the bottom right. And a close examination does really help this attribution. What's interesting about the picture of Bess as well is using this time-honoured pose coming from portraits of Habsburg women of a hand on a table or a chair in the position of power. And what's interesting is Elizabeth with a hand on her, in effect her throne, Mary on the table, Arbella taking on that royal pose, is with Bess, instead of holding a handkerchief or a fan, she holds on to her 5-string pearl necklace. And this is surely a reference that she's making about her role as the head of the dynasty, her own fecundity. Another picture in the middle is after, well, Catherine MacLeod's going to speak later, a portrait of James VI on the left in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, which is attributed to Arnold van Bronckhorst, an artist that we don't know very much about, and until the National Portrait Gallery bought a signed picture of Lord St John of Bletsoe, the attribution of the existing Scottish portraits has become something rather fluid. Clearly there was a good painter in Scotland painting these pictures, but he's not the artist who painted the NPG picture. This was then copied as a full length, so this is next door. This is the National Portrait Gallery's version. And this picture, also next door, was called Charles Lennox, Arbella's father. But when we look at the leg postures and elements of the costume, it's more likely that's a sort of prettified version of James VI as well. And these Bronkhorst pictures, the three best types, which aren't Bronkhorst, are James, Earl of Morton, both in the Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, and the Earl of Arran at Lennox Love. If you look at the right hand of each sitter, there's an interesting posture repetition. The picture that Catherine's also looking at is a picture on the left, which, with some recent research, we have this as Lord Darnley. I think it's Arbella's father, Charles. I've been looking at the picture, reproductions of the picture of Charles, which used to be in the Northwick Park collection, the bottom right. And I think there's elements about the face, which is quite different from Darnley's face, but more from Catherine later. Nigel mentioned the historicising of the house, and the two Cavendish dukes who were responsible for this were the 5th Duke on the left, painted by Bertoni, and the 6th Duke on the right, painted by Lawrence in a picture that was until recently at Castle Howard. And Christopher Rao will be speaking about the 6th Duke later. Between the 5th and 6th Duke, there were a programme of renaming of portraits to fill in missing gaps in the family's iconography has been fairly common practice in the past. An historic collection has been added to or revised, something that could be done for a number of reasons. This has certainly happened with some of the portraits at Hardwicke, where the 5th Duke renamed some of the sitters to make them into earlier Cavendishes. As has been commented before, the 1792 inventory for the 5th Duke included various portraits with either tentative titles or no sitter identities at all, whereas by the 1811 inventory, compiled following the Duke's death, most of the sitters in the portraits in the house had been named. At Hardwicke, the renamings have included the 6 portraits here, and this is just a choice of 6 to show you. So from the top left, in a clockwise direction, we have Philip II of Spain, who'd been labelled as Thomas Cavendish, a portrait inscribed as being Bessie's 3rd husband, Sir William Sindlew, in the middle, instead a rare depiction of Matthew Stewart, 4th Earl of Lennox, Darnley's father. The Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector on the top right, which was represented as another Thomas Cavendish. A 3rd Thomas Cavendish at the bottom left, which is Sir Nicholas Bacon, Elizabeth I, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. A portrait of Mary Cavendish, Countess of Shrewsbury, but currently thought to be Anne Keeley, the wife of the 1st Earl of Devonshire, at the bottom middle. And you'll recognise Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, inscribed as Henry Cavendish, the bad son we heard about. Of the losses from the picture collection, and here's one image which will be very familiar to many of you, is Holbein's cartoon, now in the National Portrait Gallery collection, for the left-hand section of the lost Whitehall mural showing Henry VII and Henry VIII. And in the detail of the 1840 Nash lithograph, which we saw earlier on the right-hand side, you can see the cartoon, and Nash has conveniently turned the head into the full frontal position, so he didn't look at it very closely, but he's got the hang right. And this is in the south bay of the Long Gallery, and it's surrounded by pictures which are still at Hardwicke. Another loss is a magnificent equestrian portrait of the 1st Duke, attributed to Adam Franz van der Meulen, seen here, that now dominates the hang on the oak staircase at Chatsworth. And it can be seen, slightly pixelated, in the detail of one of David Cox's watercolours of the Long Gallery from the late 1830s on the right-hand side, centred at the north wall where the fore-length of Elizabeth I normally hangs. And this was not its original location at Hardwicke, as the 6th Duke mentions in his handbook of the house that the large picture of him, the 1st Duke, on horseback was, till I removed it, on the wall of the landing place of the great staircase. Another portrait that I've seen recently in a private collection is the picture on the left, which is described in that collection as a portrait of an unknown woman. And it would appear instead to be a portrait of Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, the daughter of Margaret Tudor, mother of Lord Darnley and grandmother of Arbella. Arbella's claims to the English throne came through Margaret Douglas, the granddaughter of Henry VII, and her claim to the Scottish throne came through her paternal grandfather, Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox, the great-great-grandson of James II of Scotland. The inscription, it's very hard to see, there is an inscription on this picture, has the sitter's age 58 and the date 1575, which tallies with the Royal Collections picture and the detail of that picture is at the top right, although the sitter is sometimes contested as being Margaret Douglas. And we have a mourning ribbon and a mourning ring, presumably displayed rather than worn, but displayed to commemorate the murder of her husband. It also relates to, and this is something that Catherine may discuss later, or we can discuss ourselves, this strange portrait by Hilliard, which, including the black work on the sitter's sleeves and elements of the costume, has always been presumed to be Margaret Douglas. This is in the Rijksmuseum. But the nose has been altered, the colours of the eyes are slightly different. Is it the same person? Or is it based on a different picture? Hardwick isn't, as we've seen, just one of the National Trust's best houses. It's one of the most important and fascinating early houses and collections in the whole of the British Isles, and we are incredibly fortunate to be able to care for it. Today we have the opportunity to consider the portrait collection at Hardwick as being as rich and as fascinating as any other discrete part of the collection here, and as clearly deserving of more attention, not just in terms of the house, but as a survival of an Elizabethan Jacobean collection begun by one of the great 16th century patrons. Potential future conservation projects may tell us more about some of the key portraits, and we look forward to more research as undertaken into the artists and sitters represented here, and to new information coming to light that will help us understand the collection better. Thank you.